first panels of the ASA Marxism Caucus here at this year's ASA. This year's program committee for the Marxism Caucus decided to do 2 panels on the Legacies of 1968. The second panel on Legacies of 1968 is right after this at 4 o'clock, and it's more focused on the student role and the student dimensions of 1968 activism. This one is more focused on the international dimensions of 1968 activism, but oftentimes situated from within the United States, but not exclusively so. And we have some fantastic speakers here today. And again, this is to commemorate the 50th anniversary of 1968 as a year, I suppose. Without further ado, I will just basically introduce our 4 speakers and then sit down and let them take the show. So, Diane Fujino is Professor of Asian American Studies and Director of the Center for Black Studies Research at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the author of Heartbeat of Struggle, The Revolutionary Life of Yuri Kochiyama, and Samurai Among Panthers, Richard Aoki on Race, Resistance, and a Paradoxical Life. She's also the author of Wicked Theory, Naked Practice, a Fred Ho reader, as editor, and her articles on Asian American resistance and Afro-American solidarities appear in American Quarterly, Journal of Asian American Studies, Pacific Historical Review, forthcoming, and Calfu and elsewhere. So Kathleen Cleaver, who currently holds an appointment as a senior lecturer and research fellow at Emory University School of Law, has spent her life participating in human rights struggle. I'm not sure why I'm even needing to introduce Kathleen, but I'll go ahead and go through the motions. She started alongside her parents in the 1950 civil rights protests in Alabama. By 1966, Kathleen Neal dropped out of Barnard College in New York to join the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, where she served in its campus program based in Atlanta. She then moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, and from 1967 to 71, she was the first communications secretary of the Black Panther Party. After sharing years of exile in Algeria and France with former husband Eldridge Cleaver, she returned with her family to the United States in late 1975. In 1984, Cleaver graduated summa cum laude with a BA in history from Yale College and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. And after receiving a JD from Yale Law School in 1989, Cleaver became an associate at the law firm of Kravitz, Swain and Moore, later clerked for the judge A. Leon Higginbotham of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit of Philadelphia. And in 1992, she joined the faculty of Emory University Law School. So Charisse Burden-Stelly is an associate professor and Mellon Fellow of Africana Studies.
Charisse Burden-Stelly.
Charisse Burden-Stelly, sorry, is an assistant professor and Mellon Faculty Fellow of Africana Studies and Political Science at Carleton College. She is a scholar of Black critical and political theory, radical Black political economy, Black radical and intellectual thought, and the intersections of anti-communism, anti-radicalism, and anti-Blackness. She is currently working on 2 book projects. The first, Epistemologies of Blackness, Black Studies, Neoliberalization, and the Elision of Radical Black Political Economy, explores the conjecture of epistemology, institutionalization, anti-Marxism, and class politics in Black studies from 1980 to the present, and also working on W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, co-authored with Gerald Horn, revises and updates Dr. Horn's biography of Du Bois with new material, including chapters on his cultural and historical significance. Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi is the director and senior scholar in the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas. She's associate professor of ethnic studies and race and resistance studies and affiliate faculty in sexuality studies, the graduate program at San Francisco State University. She is a co-founder and editorial board member of the Islamophobia Studies Journal. She is co-author of Mobilizing Democracy, Changing U.S. Policy in the Middle East, and co-editor of Arab and Arab American Feminisms, Gender, Violence, and Belonging. She's winner of the 2012 National Arab American Nonfiction Book Award, and her work has appeared in 7 languages and across numerous media outlets from Mondo Weiss, The Guardian, and Palestine Focus. So, we'll begin, and we'll welcome our panelists, and you want to just go ahead and begin with Dr. Cleaver wanted to go last, so maybe begin with Diane first, and then go on. So, okay.
Go ahead and
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. It is wonderful to be here at a panel organized by the Marxism Caucus. And I really want to thank Chris for bringing us all together, and I'm really excited to be here and honored with my fellow panelists. And I'm speaking about the Asian American left, something that is never, hardly ever talked about and erased from history. So in the shadows of silences and absence of memory exists the opportunity to create an entirely different and distorted representation. And in the case of Asian Americans, the history of socialist, communist, and Marxist, Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino organizing came to be replaced with a narrative about the model minority and its logic of assimilationism and racial inclusion. Christina Klein, in Cold War Orientalism, presents a cogent argument about why, in the aftermath of World War II and the US rise to global dominance, representations of Asians and Pacific Islanders in Broadway hits, novels, popular magazines changed from enemy to model citizen. Simeon Mann, in the new Soldiering Through Empire, argues for the central role by Asian and Asian American soldiers in supplying not only military labor, but significantly legitimizing discourses that diminish the charges of, in his case, US involvement in Vietnam as a racist and imperial project. In this framework, the state repressed post-war Chinese American Marxism and snuffed out Japanese American radicalism, such that their very existence and their political critiques of US colonialism and ongoing racism became an absence in the national body politic. In this brief talk on Legacies of '68, I can only mention that there was an earlier Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino left, captured in the writings most famously by Carlos Bulason, but also him, Mark Lai, Yuji Chioka, Josephine Fowler. And in the late 60s and 70s, a new left formation was unique from the older one in that it was pan-Asian and also influenced by Black Power, Third World decolonization, and as they slowly began to learn it through their struggle, their own histories of radicalism. And this included the KTP in its two-line struggle around anti-imperialist homeland struggles and Filipino-American issues, issues that were often in tension with each other, as discussed in the new book by KDP, A Time to Rise. In this talk, I am focusing on Iwar Kun and also Wayman Say, in part to show the ideological and political differences that existed within the Asian American left. Iwar Kun, or IWK, first formed in New York City in November of '69, emerging from Columbia University's Asian American Political Alliance and the community-based Intergenerational Asian Americans for Action, a group started by middle-aged Japanese American radical women, something we don't hear about very much, right? Including Kazuo Ijima, who had worked with the Young Communist League in Oakland in the 30s. IWK focused on the problems in New York's Chinatown of poverty, racism, overcrowding, tuberculosis, labor, and housing problems. They launched a door-to-door TB testing campaign in Chinatown and in a community that had no hospital facilities or clinics or staff who spoke Chinese. And as the Vietnam War raged, IWK began the first drug counseling services for Asian youth. Through political education study and grassroots organizing in Chinatown, IWK activists gained knowledge that shaped their ideological and political development. One area they focused on was on women's liberation. And in Chinatown, IWK activists discovered as they talked to people in the community that there were ideas about a moral code for women that dominated, that linked femininity to domesticity. But through conversations and by reading revolutionary ideas from China, am I going back? Okay.
No, you're good.
Okay. They were reading revolutionary ideas from China about women holding up half the sky. Both the men and women gained a different social consciousness. And IWK began programs in Chinatown for the women workers and mothers and wives and daughters. And they taught Chinese history and culture, political education study, labor issues, and music and dance. And as working class Chinese women became more politically engaged, the social relations began to change between men and women, between parents and children. And to foster the participation of women in the movement and to reduce obstacles for women's leadership, IWK established collective child care programs as part of the Chinatown Women's Group, as well as for the IWK activists themselves. Men and women, parents and non-parents all participated in providing child care. About a half year before, in March of 1969, the Red Guard Party formed in San Francisco's Chinatown. And unlike the college base of IWK and most Asian American movement groups, the Red Guard consisted of primarily street youth who faced struggles with the kinds of problems associated with poverty and racism. School dropout, alcohol and drug use, a lack of constructive outlets for young people. And a group of Chinatown youth, this is pretty incredible, a group of Chinatown youth in connection with a War on Poverty agency established a pool hall to provide recreation as well as a source of money making. And the more politically conscious youth at the Leeway's pool hall formed the Red Guard Party and connected with ideas from revolutionary China as well as the Black Panther Party. And the Red Guard activists began weekly studies at the Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver's home, and I guess Kathleen Cleaver as well, though the story always reads Eldridge Cleaver.
But you paid your rent.
They were soon reading Mao, Franz Fanon, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Marx, and others. The Red Guard emulated itself after the Black Panther Party in membership programs and activities more than any other API group. And the Red Guard's 10-point program is closely patterned after the Black Panthers, all but substituting yellow for black. We want freedom, we want housing, we want all yellow men to be exempt from military service. The Red Guards also demanded that the US government recognize the People's Republic of China. And I recently learned that this isn't published anywhere, that the Red Guard platform also included a demand to protect the environment. In the summer of '71, the Red Guards and IWK New York merged to form the first national Asian American revolutionary organization, and they took the name Iwar Kun. National Iwar Kun created a 12-point platform that borrowed from the Panthers' 10-point platform in calling for self-determination, community control of institutions, education, housing, and healthcare. And IWK's platform even more closely resembled the Puerto Rican Young Lords Party. The IWK and the Young Lords were the only US Third World radical group that explicitly called for women's liberation and an end to male chauvinism. And they both also called for explicitly a socialist society, which for IWK meant working for the fulfillment of human needs, where each gives according to their needs, gives according to their ability and receives according to their needs. IWK's platform is unique in calling for childcare, reflecting women's issues, anti-pollution and sanitation, reflecting environmental issues, and an end to the geographic boundaries of America and open boundaries, representing an analysis that is needed for today's immigration struggles. National IWK formed as a revolutionary nationalist and socialist organization, but within a few months, by the end of 1971, IWK began to study Marxism-Leninism, and in 1974 adopted Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought as its guiding ideology. Former IWK member and avant-garde musician Fred Ho writes in his book, Legacy Deliberation, unlike other socialist groups of the New Left, when they became Marxist and dissolved their nationality-based organizing work for multinational workplace organizing, IWK continued to build progressive mass Asian Pacific organizations in all areas. In the long-standing left debates around nationalism and Marxism, IWK had major political differences with another significant Asian American Marxist-Leninist Maoist group, WMNSA. WMNSA formed in 1971 in the San Francisco Bay Area with the base of former UC Berkeley Asian American Political Alliance students. And after a year of organizing various political and community programs out of the Asian Community Center, and through the study of the relationship between, as they said, racism and national oppression on one side and capitalism and imperialism on the other, WMNSA came to the conclusion that as former Women's Say activist Steve Yip said, there was no such thing as a separate Chinese working class in America. Women's Say sought to challenge all forms of oppression through the fight against imperialism and capitalism. Women's Say believed that nationalism, even revolutionary nationalism, was limited by the class viewpoint constrained within the affairs of a single nation. Instead, the struggle needed to be international. Women's Say promoted slogans such as "Workers unite to lead the fight against all oppression." IWK, as you might imagine, had sharp differences with Women's Say, and while IWK's ideology certainly supported internationalism and labor struggles, they charged Women's Say with liquidating, this is what they called it, right? Liquidating the national question. Their differences emerged in the widely known international hotel struggle for affordable housing and against gentrification in San Francisco, as well as in the Zhongsai garment workers strike in San Francisco's Chinatown in 74 to 75. In that strike, both groups participated in walking picket lines, attending rallies, leafleting, issuing press releases. They did the practical work of organizers. But many of Women's Say's leaflets spoke about workers' oppression and the exploitation of immigrants, but omitted any explanation for the special oppression of Chinese, arising out of years of super exploitation and other forms of national oppression. At one point, when the Chinese workers chanted in Chinese, "Chinese people unite," Women's Say and its allied Revolutionary Union tried to drown them out with "Workers unite." IWK criticized that by universalizing the proletariat struggle, Women's Say failed to consider the particulars of national oppression faced by Chinatown workers. By contrast, IWK focused on national oppression as fundamentally intertwined with capitalist exploitation, which meant that they viewed Chinatown women garment workers, strikers, the strike arising from a combination of class exploitation, national and gender oppression, and imperialist relations that fostered Asian immigration. And I think we see some echoes of this, right, in the Black Lives Matter versus the All Lives Matter kinds of debates. In 1978, IWK united with the Chicano Marxist-Leninist organization, the August 29th movement, to dissolve their organizations into a new multinational formation, the League of Revolutionary Struggle. They were soon joined by several groups, including Amiri Baraka's Congress of African Peoples. By the mid-80s, the League of Revolutionary Struggle was the largest Marxist-Leninist organization in the US and unique for its majority oppressed nationality, membership, and leadership, and majority women, and notably Asian women leadership. The LRS worked in great many progressive organizations, including the Jesse Jackson presidential campaigns of the 1980s. So, why does knowing Asian American radicalism matter? And I offer a few ideas, but there's much more to talk about, right? So first, Asian American radicalism is a corrective to the absence of the memory of the Asian American left. And by this I mean Marxism, socialism, revolutionary nationalism / internationalism that can be seen as competing as well as overlapping ideologies. And this erasure of Asian American radical activism and critiques of racial capitalism and imperial domination enables the legitimizing discourses and structures of liberal democracy, with its appearance of equality while continuing to authorize empire building, and particular to this narrative, right, US Pacific expansionism. And this has implications for today's struggles. In the immigrant rights movement, there was a shift from the huge May 1, 2006 immigrant marches, where there was an abundance, if you recall, of US flag waving, and where calls for inclusion reproduced the view of a benevolent US nation state. Today, we see less flag waving, a centralization of undocumented immigrants, which wasn't so prevalent a decade ago, and a greater criticism, of course, of the brutal policies of the Trump administration. But what is still largely lacking is a learning from a demand such as IWK's call for open boundaries and radical critiques of capitalist displacements of people and local economies and US-sponsored violence in homelands that's fueling today's migration. Such a critique could help to transform the public discourse from notions of invaders to holding the US state and corporations culpable for such displacements. Second, I see in the history of the Asian American left a basis for building the new social relations and revolutionary practices, ones that include promoting women's leadership and the leadership of vulnerable communities, promoting collective leadership that I didn't get to talk about, but that I think was very central in many ways to the Asian American left, and implementing childcare and other practices that address the triple struggle of racialized gender liberation in the home, the workplace, and the movement. And third, as Laura Polito has found in her study of Black, Chicano, and Asian American radical organizing in LA in the late 60s and 70s, Asian Americans extended greater third world solidarities than any other community. And the first 3 points of IWK's 12-point platform call for self-determination for Asian Americans, self-determination for Asians, and self-determination for all third world peoples and other oppressed peoples. For IWK, this was a solidarity rooted in global decolonial struggles, inspired by the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference of 1955. So what does it mean when the major mainstream images of Asian American protests today center on the problematic affirmative action lawsuit at Harvard, or the large rallies by Chinese Americans in support of the police officer Peter Liang, who killed Akai Gurley in a New York housing project, right? Stairwell. What shifts when we insert histories of Asian American radicalism into 1968 and 2018? How is Asian American self-determination linked to the self-determination of all oppressed communities? Finally, I end with Cedric Robinson's description in Black Marxism of the Black radical tradition as an accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. The study of Asian American radicalism is also an epistemological project, one that enables us to make present the absences of history and to advance knowledge as collective endeavors across the generations, not only in the academy, but as Cedric Robinson says, through political struggle. The recuperation of knowledge about and knowledge created by the Asian American left forms the kind of collective intelligence gathered from struggle that we need now more than ever in today's increasingly urgent struggle. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I begin by honoring the indigenous people on whose stolen land we stand today. I thank the Marxism section and ASA for making it possible for me to participate here, and I also want to invite you this evening at 6 p.m. to our panel on teaching Palestine, pedagogical practice, and the indivisibility of justice. That is a continuation of a project that I'm not going to talk about today, but I will mention that it does honor the 50th anniversary of the 1968, but it also honors it in a critical manner. So we're not only celebrating what happened 50 years ago, but we are holding what happened 50 years ago accountable to where we're at today and where we need to go. So my topic is who is a Marxist, a critical review of the Palestinian New Left. So I'm going to, I actually wrote it out, but I'm going to speak it. So basically I'm talking about the Arab national movement that became the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine after 1967 and became one of the leading forces in the world, in the Palestinian left. And this is a very long life project of mine. I'm also working on the connections between the Palestinian quote-unquote secular left, and I have a problem with that, and my Islamist groups in the region, and how do we think about that, the alliances and so on. What is the role of colonialism and anti-colonialism in that? How do we think about the various formations? How do we think about the neoliberalism today, and so on? But that's a very long, so I'm going to just focus on a very small slice. I'm more than happy to have more discussions, but if I go all over the place, I won't be able to finish. So, in 1952, two students, two medical students, George Habash and Wadi Haddad, at the American University of Beirut, came together and created something called the Arab National Movement. The origins of the Arab National Movement was not accidental. They were first of all mentored, like people here in SNCC by Robert Williams, were mentored by Konstantin Zrek, who actually created an inside clandestine study group, specifically by invitation only, to students who were at the AUB, American University of Beirut, to study and learn about anti-colonialism. They were both of them came from Palestine in the 1948 areas, and they both became students after Nakba, the Palestinian displacement. Habash came from Lid, and Wadi Haddad came from Safad. Safad, if people do not know, is also the hometown of the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen, who basically said he doesn't really want to go back and he's happy to relinquish it. If Wadi Haddad had lived and has not been assassinated by the Israeli Mossad, which we only found out in 2006 according to Israeli classified archives, he would have said no, he would have disagreed with that and not relinquished the right of Palestinian refugees, as we know the current US administration is trying to do. Why did the Arab National Movement emerge? Was there nothing in the region at the time? There were a lot of political forces in the region, but first of all, the Nakba had exposed the Arab regimes that were existing at that time. Jordan was already collaborating with the Zionists, and the 1950 Jericho Conference basically annexed the West Bank to Jordan, which was the remaining part of Palestine. Egypt was ruled by monarchy. Various Arab countries, Syria and Iraq, were ruled by the sons of Sharif Hussein from Mecca, Faisal and Abdullah. So it was the situation in the region, and actually 1948, they call Arab-Israeli war, when Israel presented as Arab governments, Arab armies coming to attack Israel, actually was a joke, because there wasn't really such a resistance by Arab armies, because the Arab governments did not arm the armies and prepare them to resist. There were people who resisted, and there were Palestinians who resisted, but basically Palestine fell in 1948. So that was one of the main impetus for creating this movement. The other thing is that 1950, if you recall, this was the era of quote-unquote decolonization. This was post-World War II, and many people in Africa and Asia and Latin America were asking for decolonization. There were also other forces in the region. The Ba'ath has already existed. In 1947, it was found in Lebanon, but it wasn't in power yet. And so it was, and then in Iraq, people were fighting against the Baghdad Pact, which was actually framed after the NATO alliance of an imperialist pact, and people were fighting against it. The other third party in the region, the other third oppositional formation, the communists, there were a lot of problems with the communists in the region. One is that, and it wasn't actually anti-communist per se. It was not anti-communist. That's not where it came from, although some of it was anti-communist, was nationalist, Arab nationalist. But because, first of all, the Palestinian Communist Party that was started in 1923 had split after 1948, after Palestine fell. In 1951, the Jordanian Communist Party came to exist, which was led mostly by Palestinians, and the Israeli Communist Party came about, which was led mostly by Jewish Israelis, even though 95% of the membership was Palestinian. And there was a very small party, Palestinian Communist Party, that remained in Gaza, led by Dr. Haidar Abdulhadi, who was later to lead the Palestinian delegation at the Madrid, but was too small. So it was really the communists per se. The communist movement was not rising to the task of what would happen after Nakba. But almost most importantly is that the Soviet Union's position, Stalin at the time, on May 17th, 1948, 3 days after Israel declared its independence, they recognized Israel de jure. The Soviet Union became the first country to grant de jure recognition to Israel. The first country to get. So for that, the socialist world, the communist, the Soviet Union, the communist Comintern was not really a place to go for Palestinian solidarity and so on. Later on, the Palestinians will build relations exactly like the Black Panthers and other parties actually with Maoist China and have support with Mao. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the relations with Arab countries were actually quite bad until in there was also the Muslim Brotherhood was actually quite prominent in the region. But the Muslim Brotherhood, after 1952, which was around the same time that the Arab National Movement was founded, there was an overthrow in Egypt by the Free Officers Movement led by Jamal Abdel Nasser, and the Muslim Brotherhood movement chose to actually go in opposition. So there was not a possibility for them to align with the Arab National Movement. So there was actually a need for the Arab National Movement. The Arab National Movement was not inspired by Bandung then. It might be inspired today by the spirit of Bandung, but by then it was not. Because Bandung was a formation of of governments. It was decolonizing governments that came together. The Arab National Movement was ambivalent about Nasser. They liked Nasser because he was anti-colonial, he was standing up to, and at the beginning, until the Suez Canal, the 1956 war, he was sort of ambivalent about the US and so on. Afterwards, it was the non-capitalist path of development and non-alignment and so on. So there were always this kind of like, is Nasser trying to contain? Is he building alliances with other people like what? Is he building alliances with anyway? So Bandung was not really the place to turn to, but they were Arab nationalists. But shortly there, and there were a lot of stuff in the Arab world going on at the time, which I'm going to go very fast over. Because the conditions in the region, what happened with the Arab National Movement is actually it became the formation that embodied Arab opposition in all over. So the Arab National Movement was involved in the Algerian liberation struggle, was involved in Kuwait, was involved later on, actually very much involved in supporting the Popular Front for the Liberation of Oman, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, the Iraqi support with the Iraqi communists, support with the Sudanese Communist Party. I mean, everywhere in the Arab world. And until today, leaders of the opposition throughout the Arab world, many of them come from the Arab National Movement and have not really shown. So this is kind of like something that has been long lasting. After 1967, okay, and there is a lot of stuff I'm going to skip about all the stuff, the US imperialist intervention in Lebanon and elsewhere and so on. We can talk about that later on. But there was this wave throughout the 50s of opposition all over and actually winning elections sometimes in Jordan and so on. And everything was overthrown, just like what happened in Iran in 1953 by overthrowing Mossadegh. Everywhere, the US was coming really full force to try to diminish any kind of possibilities for change and opposition and decolonization. Both because they want to control oil, and secondly because it's the strategic location of the region. So these two issues were there, and the alliances with Iran and with Israel serve these purposes. So I think when people say that Israel is only a product of the US or the US is led by Israel, I don't agree with that formation. I think that it's a very dialectical relationship between the two. Now, after 1967, the Arab National Movement realized that actually Arab nationalism is not enough. Organizing Arab nationalism is not enough. And there was a very big debate among the Palestinian movement what to do after the 67, again, another loss by Arab governments. So what the Arab National Movement and others, like Fatah and so on, they decided to take over the Palestine Liberation Organization. And the Arab National Movement decided to transform itself into a Marxist-Leninist group. So now we have the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist group, which I have questions about what is a Marxist and what is not, because if it goes to classical Marxism, it doesn't really fit very well. And Arab Marxists in the region, communists, always label the PFLP as infantile leftism and adventurous, irresponsible. And much of it had to do with the armed struggle that the PFLP had adopted. I mean, really, and lack of recognition of Israel. This was a very major issue. Fatah decided that there is no faith in the Arab masses, and we need to go it alone as Palestinians. The PFLP said, no, we are going to build alliances with all the Arab oppositional movements. And actually, there was very strong alliance with all Arab oppositional movement that ended up also costing the PFLP a lot in terms of support and so on, and actually also supporting Fatah to get the petrodollars. So until I think 1991 or something, Saudi Arabia never ever had an office for the PLO. It always had an office for Fatah, but not for the PLO. They never recognized. They pumped millions and millions of dollars of petrodollars into the Palestinian movement. And in another life, actually in your article, in your book, Shunet and Sohail, I argue about the effects of petrodollars, but so I'm not going to spend time doing it here. But basically, at post-1967, there is a very important, and there is now linkages with other international groups. There is linkages with China, because now China is actually very supportive of national liberation movements, as everybody knows, from multiple things, including Robin Kelly's Brilliant Mao, Black Like Mao, and so on. And it was very similar to that. There was a lot of connection with Cuba. And so on October 8th, 1967, is it, was it 1967? When, no, 1968, right, when Che Guevara was killed? 1967. Everywhere in the Arab world, you will hear the song by Ahmed Fuad Najm and Sheikh Imam, the two communists in Egypt, singing Guevara mad, Guevara mad. Che Guevara died, he died, the hero died over his tank and everybody knew this. I mean, there was a wave of anti-colonial liberation that was going on. It was also a very important period, and I'm also going to have time to get into it, but this was also about human liberation. It was not only about land. So they would say we are for the liberation of land and man, human, but not only for land. So it was. This is also a very big difference from other. The problem is with the PFLP is that pretty soon everybody has gotten involved to kind of like undermine Palestinian resistance. The other problem is that it was led by two Christians in a Muslim majority Muslim area, and the Palestinian opposition competition actually never ever lost an opportunity to keep reminding George Habash. I mean, they never say Habash, and his nickname was Al-Hakim, the wise man, but they always said George Habash, emphasize that to undermine, and it did undermine actually a lot, you know, about, even though my work on relationship with Islam and so on, Habash says, I am a Muslim, I'm a Muslim Arab nationalist, Marxist, internationalist. I mean, has been always part of who people are in the region. This whole sectarianism and secular fundamentalism does not really work very well. But soon enough, there was a debate, the debates, how much time do I have? 10 minutes? Oh, wow, beautiful. Okay, great. A couple of minutes?
Yeah.
2 minutes, okay. So, I want to talk about three very important points. One is the split with Maoism. So this was a very important period, because for Marxist history, this was a very important period when actually the PFLP splits with Marxism, with Maoism, because actually now Maoism is itching towards the US. Mao actually recognizes Numeri's government in Sudan, which was slaughtering people left and right. Mao gets closer to Sadat in Egypt, who was the mastermind of Camp David. So there is, and at the same time, the Soviet Union is now paying attention to the Palestinians and thinking that maybe we would like to have somebody else aside from the Israeli Communist Party and the Jordanian Communist Party, just people who go attend Comintern and just sit, you know, around. I mean, they were part of the national communist movement, so I don't want to undermine their contribution. And they were great thinkers in the Israeli Communist Party and the Jordanian Communist Party. But they were now looking at it, but there was a very big problem, that the PFLP had to think about coexistence, peaceful coexistence, because there was a very big debate between China and the Soviet Union, because Mao is China and the Soviet Communist Party. And the second aspect was all the political operations that they were doing. They called it external hijacking planes, killing Israelis all over the place, you know, doing all this stuff and so on. So the PFLP made a decision to actually come closer, and at that time also the DFLP, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, had split from the PFLP and created a new organization. But that was also, and Arafat was supporting the DFLP, kind of like. So this was in a context where the PFLP, and I'm still not clear, I have not formulated why I think if this is right or wrong, or what do I think about it, but they did basically suspend all external operations. They declared support for the Soviet line of peaceful coexistence, and in order for them to maintain this, they never actually made relations with Arab governments, reactionary governments, to get funding by petrodollars and so on, and they remained actually steadfast around their line. In 1973-74, with the Palestinian National Council came up with its 10-point program to basically accept what became later on as a state on the West Bank and Gaza. The PFLP went and formed something called the Rejectionist Front in Iraq, and aligned themselves with the Ba'ath Party in Saddam Hussein there, and Syria and Algeria and Yemen, Democratic Yemen at the time. And basically but they have never ever given up on Western Sahara. They have never given up on any of Arab oppositional movements. And that's actually quite important. The other thing that really they really undermined the PFLP in particular, but also Fatah as well, is the assassinations by the Israeli Mossad, which is very similar if people, to relate to it, Cointelpro, okay, that the majority of the leaders actually were the intellectuals, the fighters, the thinkers, they were all assassinated. So they deprived the movement of its leadership. and so on. Now the last one is I want to mention is that the PFLP was very internationalist, had trained the Iranians, had trained the Kurds, have trained people in El Salvador and Nicaragua. I'm sure you can see in their memoirs, Chile, near Chile. They've had relations with people across, and I'm not going to mention them all, but the very interesting thing is that, two things is that, historically, if you go and look at the history of the African National Congress, or you look at Algeria, you don't find the Arab National Movement of the PFLP. The relationship, even the Black Panthers, it was Fatah. Everybody would say Fatah. ANC would say Fatah. And it is very interesting to think about why is that the case. It had to do, I think, I'm hypothesizing, that had to do with lack of resources, number one, and two, lack of information. I mean, PFLP historically was not really good about doing publicity and mobilizing and promotion and so on. And also they shied away, and I think it had to do with the personality also of George Habash himself, who was too modest to actually promote and propagate. And this is actually a lot of people in the PFLP have criticized him, the people I'm talking with right now. But something that remains from what the PFLP did then is when we think about the Arab revolutions in 2011. When Arab revolutions came about in 2011, everybody started repeating a saying from George Habash that the road to Palestine goes through Cairo and Jordan and all the Arab capitals, meaning two things. One is that you cannot liberate Palestine in an area that is completely filled with petrodollars, with the reactionary forces, with US imperialist military bases and so on. And two, that you really need to think about what I'm borrowing from Martin Luther King and calling the indivisibility of justice. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so the title of my paper is 1968 is Black, World Systemic Revolution and Radical Blackness in the United States. Not least because I want to center the role of sort of radical Black formation in 1968 as a world historical moment. Often this time period can be quite whitewashed or shift toward a discussion about sort of cultural affinity or aesthetic production, but this was a deeply anti-systemic moment whereby persons are trying to agitate for a new formation inherent in socialism or other anti-capitalist forms. So I'm going to start with a quote from C.L.R. James from an article called World Revolution 1968. Quote, from the very beginning, it has to be made clear that the economic relations, political relations, safeguarding of the revolution against military intervention or financial pressure, every single aspect of daily and political life now depends on the transformation of the bourgeois institutions into socialist institutions, the unleashing of the strength of the working class, first of all. I am afraid I'm not being as successful in saying what I want to say as I would like it to be. We do not make the revolution to achieve the socialist society. The socialist society makes the revolution, end quote. So again, 1968 was a moment of world historical significance, not least because of the deluge of anti-systemic revolts. So for instance, we have student uprisings around the world. One example of this are the student uprisings in Senegal, starting on May 27, 1968. Student organizations implemented a strike and boycott of exams, not least to protest continued imperialism and various political, economic, and social crises in the country. And that student movement ultimately mobilized workers, and so Leopold Senghor's regime was very much in crisis at that time. And he responded with political repression, as most regimes did, and with the expulsion of foreign students. There's also labor strikes. In May 1968, there were massive wildcat strikes in France, which represented a cultural and social rebellion of more than 10 million workers. And this workers' movement ultimately sparked women's and gay liberation movements shortly thereafter. And these wildcat strikes were influenced by Third Worldism, so Maoism, Che Guevara, and the work of Ho Chi Minh. So it was ultimately a rejection of hierarchical bourgeois society in France. And then likewise, we see 1968 manifested in sport. So there was the Black Power protests of the San Jose University students, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, as well as the massive anti-apartheid campaign to prevent South Africa's participation in the 1968 Mexico City Games. And so ultimately, 1968 was a moment of rejection of United States hegemony and dollar imperialism, of Cold War nuclear threat. So it wasn't just a contestation of the United States, but also the Soviet Union in terms of the imposition of Cold War geopolitics. It was a rejection of global white supremacy. It was also a rejection of anti-communist suppression of radicals, revolutionaries, and freedom fighters. And here, as we know, anti-communism operates not only to suppress communists, but all sorts of forms of radicalism, not least internationalism. So communism becomes a synecdoche for any sort of challenge to the capitalist state. Likewise, there was just a general rejection of conservatism, the conservatism of state institutions, especially university. Right, and within the Constitution of the United States, there was a rejection of the Eurocentrism of the university, right? This idea that racialized persons had contributed nothing to history. It was a rejection of conformity and the conformist culture that permeated these campuses, as well as the ways in which these institutions essentially operated as settler colonies, right? So they were completely disembedded from local communities. They hoarded the tax dollars and resources, but gave virtually nothing back. And so as more and more students started to attend these colleges and universities, they demanded a much more sort of sustained connection to these surrounding communities, and that these surrounding communities should benefit from the largesse that the government was bestowing upon these institutions. The development of the new left also represented a challenge to the old left articulations of communism, social democracy, and anti-colonial nationalism, not least because the majority of persons were not seeing the benefits of these models. These models seemed to be out of step with the crises of urbanization, with the continued sort of police occupation of urban communities, and with the fundamental inability to redistribute wealth and resources. So I'm gonna talk about the Black Studies movement in particular, not least because I'm in Black Studies, but also because I think that this is a missing narrative in this 1968 moment. So with the turn to diaspora, right? Diaspora as a sort of intellectual project, there was also this push to decenter African Americans, because African Americans are said to be racially essentialist, right? Parochial Black nationalists, and to reify the Black-white binary. And I would like to push back against that. While some of that is certainly true, there's also a way in which African Americans are deeply internationalist, and they're actually a very, very important group in this conception of tricontinentalism and third worldism. And I think Anne Garland Mahler's new book, From the Tricontinental to the Global South, she's right there, hey, that's good, it actually gets at this very, gets at this in a really important way. So essentially, I'm using the Black Studies movement as a hermeneutic, right, to understand the importance of what I call radical Blackness to 1968 as a world historical moment of rupture. So in terms of what I mean by radical Blackness is, it is the communist, socialist, and leftist analyses of the structural and material conditions of local, national, and global Blackness, and efforts to imagine and bring into being liberating possibilities for all oppressed people. It centers critical political economy, analysis, attends to interracial class conflict and antagonism, theorizes the international character of Blackness as a special condition of surplus value extraction, and strives for the eventual overthrow of capitalism. Informed by and engaged with real-world struggles, radical Blackness encompasses African descendants' multivalent and persistent anti-systemic and counter-hegemonic challenges to political economies and legitimating discourses that sustain racialized and gendered exploitation and exclusion, dispossession, and class-based domination. It's often routed through or enunciated from within the United States, given the latter's importance to the development of the capitalist world economy since the 17th century, its rise to global hegemony after World War II, its histories of anti-Black terror rooted in capitalist imperialism, and endemic anti-radical liberal statist pedagogy. As such, radical blackness has variously been targeted by statist and imperial authorities as extremism, as we see with black identity extremism, right? Authoritarianism and terrorism to rationalize the use of extraordinary force, violence, and exclusion. So as a political project, the Black Studies movement was inaugurated in the 1960s by students and community-based demands for a more relevant education. And this represented the sort of intellectual expression of political Pan-Africanism in United States colleges and universities. Students were agitating for a culturally legible education with utility beyond the ivory tower that fundamentally challenged the imperialist, white supremacist, and bourgeois logics of traditional disciplines. They also demanded economic development for local and global communities, Black self-determination and racial equality, and the importance of internationalist frameworks to connecting African descendant struggles for liberation in the global North and the global South. The Pan-Africanist ethos undergirding Black student militancy was manifested in the characterization of their struggles in terms of third worldism. So we see this with the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State College and at the University of California at Berkeley. Not least because they're understanding themselves as an internal colony, which I'll get back to a bit later. And so there's been a lot of sort of critique of that model, but I think that at least in terms of analogy, it makes sense because not unlike the 1928 Black Belt thesis, they're understanding their oppression as a form of national oppression, not a form of ethnic discrimination, right? It's something much more entrenched and endemic. Black students drew upon the anti-imperial, anti-colonial, and anti-racist insurgencies in Africa, the Caribbean, and the global decolonizing world more broadly as a metaphor and analogy for their position as an internal colony. There was also an intellectual spirit of cultural nationalism that animated struggles for Black studies on predominantly white and historically Black college campuses alike. And so at this moment, cultural nationalism in sort of the rightist manifestation had not become hegemonic in Black studies in the way that it is today, quite frankly. There were a lot of different competing interests, and there was a strong Marxist contingency at this moment. And all groups had a sort of some cultural grounding. All groups argue for the grounding of education in the history and culture of African descendants. Black studies was envisioned to be a space to confront the cultural apparatus of the United States and to counterbalance the historical effects of white cultural particularism and the universalization of whiteness as the standard way of being in the world. That denied the validity of competing values, standards, and epistemologies. So I'm going to talk about the Black Studies project with respect to its epistemological project, its ethical practice, and its a political project. So it's not only just a political project, right? It's these three things in my opinion. With respect to epistemology, I mean that the Black Studies movement offered a way of knowing, understanding, and envisioning the world. And this is manifested in this demand for a more relevant education. So relevancy beyond just the mere accumulation of knowledge with no practical application, right? And the accumulation of knowledge that emanates from basically 5 countries in the world. And this is still how we're taught, right? Mm-hmm. England, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, mostly men. And they were making these sort of larger connections to anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-war activism, international solidarity, and inter-ethnic solidarity, as well as revolutionary nationalism. And again, this is enunciated through the conception of Black folk as an internal colony, and also as third world subjects, right? So third world subjects in the belly of the beast as such. With respect to ethical practice, I mean cooperative social activity based on shared values, a common conception of social good, and mutual political goals. So there's a fundamental rejection of individualism and of careerism at this moment. There's expectations and standards that are set and maintained through consistent participation in a variety of interactions, including conversations, debate, organizing, institution building, and political struggle. Ethical practice is dependent upon justice and honesty to ensure equal treatment among comrades. Importantly, it also demands courage, that is to say, the willingness to put oneself at risk for the betterment of others, to cultivate reciprocal care and concern. So one way that I sort of conceptualize this is through a concept called mutual comradeship, which includes protection from a defense against state repression, dedication of time and other resources to left-wing causes, mutual support for radical organizations, institutions, and periodicals, and sharing knowledge, tactics, and strategies. So as we see, as a lot of these Black Studies protests are cropping up throughout the nation, they're sharing information, they're sharing tactics, they're learning from each other, they're talking to each other, they're submitting articles to not only school newspapers, but also sort of community-based newspapers. The Black Panther newspaper was extremely important for disseminating information about the Black Studies strikes in the Bay Area. Likewise, many unions were backing the Black Studies movement, right? And so they were getting beat up too. When these cops come and occupy these campuses, ordinary workers who did not attend these universities were being subjected to extreme forms of violence. Mutual comradeship also requires concern for and responsibility to all stigmatized and oppressed groups, given their linked fates, even as they're organizing around their own sort of ethno-racial affinities. Another aspect of ethical practice is guerrilla struggle, either in terms of ideology or in terms of practice, right? So a way of this sort of insurgent form of violence or sort of insurgent form of challenging these structures of domination becomes extremely important. We see this in many of the discussions, for instance, that circulated in the Tricontinental Conference of 1966, the importance of guerrilla warfare, guerrilla struggle in the service of peace, right? Because as we know, violence in the service of peace is not the same as violence in the service of imperialism and imposition and dispossession. With respect to politics, the politics of Black Studies were really organized around self-determination, redistribution, solidarity, and unity. So for instance, at the University of California at Berkeley, there were demands for a third world college. There were demands for third world people in positions of power to control the department. So not only the departments, but also getting rid of the surveillance architecture whereby white people are running these programs, determining the curriculum, and deciding who does and doesn't get tenure. They demanded increased enrollment and financial aid, so we can see this ethics of care. They just don't want to bring more racialized students there, but also they need the resources to be able to matriculate these campuses. They're demanding community programs, better wages for workers on campuses, so staff and administration. They're demanding the involvement of third world people at all levels of the university, so not just the third world college, but also in financial aid offices, in sort of the upper echelons of the university, on the board of directors. So again, that they're not sort of ghettoized, but rather that people, racialized people, are integrated at all levels to be able to engage in power sharing and have practical impact on what decisions are being made. So there was a variety of tactics that were used to implement these goals that included sit-ins, petitions, demonstrations, picket lines, campus strikes where students. So now, right, we Diane for a term, then we go back and study for our exams. These people were out for quarters, semesters, or sometimes whole years. And sometimes they didn't go back until years and years later to finish their education, right? So this was a fundamental commitment, I think, to not only struggle on campus, but struggle more broadly. And this is not to, drag current activism. There was also formation of sort of indigenous campus organizations. So this is when we see like the explosion of like Black student unions. So these are not spontaneous uprisings. They're organizing, they're learning, right? They're building structural apparatuses to be able to have longevity. They storm the stages during lectures and celebrations, not just call-out culture, not just tell Bernie or Hillary they're white. They know that, by the way. But sort of to disrupt the presence of these sort of racist and colonial people like on these campuses. They're issuing demands. They're engaging in hunger strikes. They're holding administrators hostage. One of my favorites. There's also a development of systems of secret cells and codes to organize resistance and to avoid infiltration. One thing that's left out of a lot of these books about this historical moment is the ubiquity of infiltration, right?
That's right.
All skin ain't kin. And so I'm doing right now this project on Richard Gibson, who's brought up in a number of these texts uncritically. Richard Gibson was destabilizing all sorts of things, right? And this and it had a big impact on, let us say, Black revolutionary nationalist groups back in UNITA, over MPLA, back in the PAC, over the ANC, right? And so because of the ways in which he had these international networks, he was able to really drive that policy. And he also worked for like a CIA front journalist firm run out of Chicago. So he also was able to publish his articles and have these articles syndicated in a lot of newspapers, not least The Liberator, which is an important, it's an important sort of black left periodical, which, not dragging The Liberator, I'm just saying that there's a way in which he had his hands in all sorts of things, and we really need to pay attention to that and critique, and think about that. They also were trying to get groups of Black students to register for the same courses so that there weren't these feelings of alienation and isolation in these classes, and so that, when professors are being racist and white supremacists, there can be a cadre of people that are like, nah. They're taking over faculty meetings and seizing buildings, and so there's a variety of tactics, right? These are not monolithic. This is not a monolithic movement. These were sophisticated students. Many of them had come from the civil rights movement. Many of them had military training from having served in either Korea or Vietnam. And so they're thinking. It's not just a bourgeois cultural nationalist insurgency, as a lot of people like to say it. How things ended up doesn't mean that's how they started, right? So I think that we need to reinsert the Black Studies movement and the ethnic studies movement more broadly into these discussions about 1968. In conclusion, the importance of you as Black people as a group in the larger international struggle against imperialism, capitalism, and coloniality is extremely important. Black Americans, there was a group of Black Americans who were not sort of a provincial and parochial, but were actually understanding themselves as part of a larger global project of liberation. And if we're gonna have what Charles P.O. has called nostalgia for the future, right? Which is it's routed through the 1960s at this moment in a particular way. There's a sort of like veneration of this aestheticized and very abstract notion of what the 1960s were. We need to attend to the structural and material project in which these insurgencies were invested, not just the cultural and the aesthetic, right? And so I would invite us to rethink historiography and rethink our scholarship in light of what the goal of Black studies and what the goal of the 1968 insurgency more broadly was about. Thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here, especially because I didn't have my program at home and actually completely spaced on the fact that I was supposed to be here, so somebody called me. So thank you for giving me a call.
Thank you, Chris.
It's not just that. My son recently died, and I was spending a lot of time talking with a friend about what I was going to do and how I was going to plan a memorial, etc. So my mind was somewhere else. But my body is here, so I'm glad that I'm glad that I'm able to join you. The topic I was asked to talk about the SNCC and the Black Panther Party structures, which it's interesting. I was in both. I was in SNCC as it was in the process of decomposing, and in the Panther Party as in when it was in the process of blossoming. And so, in fact, I never actually got to join the Black Panther Party. I just showed up. And at one point, you get membership cards, and they point out your name and this. And when I showed up, I had already met Eldridge Cleaver because we invited a group of scholars to come. I was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. which this panel is about SNCC and the Panthers, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. At that moment, we called it the non-student, non-violent, non-coordinated, non-committed. We were ready for the revolution. We wanted a little bit more, and we were planning a conference. I was in a structure of SNCC called the Campus Program. What we did is reach out to campuses and try to organize students to become activists. And we had a whole group of different community, different colleges where students had been organized, and we were bringing them all together to Fisk University in Nashville for a conference. And I think the conference was called Liberation Will Come From a Black Thing. So this is, Black power has already been articulated, but we're gonna encourage people to relate to it, because SNCC by that time, the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is what it stood for. When we said, well, we're the non-student, non-coordinated, non-committed, we were in transition. And the chairman at that time was, when I came, it was Stokely Carmichael, and I believe he was, the next election, the chairman became someone who is known as Rat Brown. If you don't know who Rat Brown is, raise your hand, because he's been in prison for so long, a lot of people think he's dead. He is not. He's in Tucson. He's in prison in a frame up here in Atlanta for police shooting. I happened to live in Atlanta at that time, and I happened to be a character witness in his trial, and the trial was held, I would say, 2 or 3 days after the 9/11 attacks. And we called him Jamil, he changed his name. Jamil Al-Amin came into court in his full regalia as an Islamic imam. 2 days after. Anyway, I was still a character witness. It's not that surprising that he was convicted. But it was appropriate. This is someone they had to get rid of. Now, I want to go into this notion of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party, the name the Black Panther came from organization that SNCC people, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee people in a project in Lowndes County were organizing for an electoral challenge. In Alabama, in Lowndes County, Alabama, 90% Black. No one had ever really run for office from that part of Alabama. You needed a symbol for your electoral status. So like the Democrats, donkey, and Republicans, an elephant. The Black Panther Party in Lowndes County took an animal that lived in Lowndes County, which was a panther. And so their name became the Black Panther Party because of their symbol. And their slogan was, Lowndes County is 80% Black. The Black Panther is going to eat up the white rooster. The white rooster was the slogan, the symbol for the Democratic Party, or whatever party they had there. I don't know whether they're Republican or Democrat. They were white racists, I think. And so I was in that movement as SNCC was collapsing and not getting any more money because they took the Black Power position, and many of the supporters felt that wasn't about integration. That wasn't about nonviolence. In fact, when I got there, they say we're the non-violent, non-coordinated, non-committee. We're ready for revolution. I met a revolutionary named Cleaver at a conference that SNCC held in Nashville. The conference was to bring all the student groups that we had been organizing with to Nashville and bring all these intellectual writers, people like Leroy Jones and Sonia, whatever. Whatever we planned, it didn't happen because it was a snowfall and all the airports on the East Coast were closed. Eldridge Cleaver lived in California. His airport wasn't closed. He was the only speaker of all of them that invited to our conference in Nashville. And by that time he got there, they already said, you can't have it at Fisk. The preacher at the school said, you're gonna have it in our church. Why? Because Stokely Carmichael, who was the chair of our organization, was identified with Black Power, and Black Power is identified with violence. So if you're gonna have a conference and you're gonna bring these students from all over, well, the Fisk University just didn't want to handle it. They just didn't want to handle it. And in fact, it was so upset, and the police were so upset that there were two members of SNCC who were driving to Nashville to join the conference. They hadn't even got there yet, and they got arrested. Because, you know, you're one of those radical, bushy-haired Negroes, we don't want you coming. But anyway, so this was the Vietnam War era. People were dying. This was a Black Power era. It was very challenging. This was a white racist era. I mean, George Wallace was on the ballot. It was, I'd say, a lot more lively than it is right now because of the Vietnam War, because of the disruption that the war was causing, like dragging so many young men out of entire Black high schools were just eviscerated of young men. So the issue of opposing the draft, opposing the war was very big. The Black Panther Party was clearly not in support of the Vietnam War, and people who had been in the Vietnam War or who had been trying to avoid the Vietnam War, many of them joined the Black Panther Party. So we had an organization in which there was a significant number of Black men who were familiar with weapons, who were familiar with organizations, and who were devoted and concerned with this concept that we articulated, Black liberation. And freedom now, well, we went through that, but the freedom now was associated with nonviolence and peace and love. So the Black Panther Party, we don't have anything against peace and love, but we want to be an armed organization, and we want to transform society and eliminate economic discrimination, racial discrimination, and our focus became on police brutality. I don't think the Black Panther Party ever got passed, as that was point number 7. But the brutality of the police was such, it was enormous in the sense that there were 3 Panthers, you probably never even heard of it. We called them Tommy, Steve, and Robert, riding in a car in Los Angeles, going somewhere, they got stopped by the police, they were all killed. I mean, most people never even heard about that. They heard about the stop of Huey Newton because we made a big deal, and Huey Newton got in a conflict in a arrest situation with a policeman in Oakland, and he was armed, and the policeman was armed, or he took the policeman's gun. I'm not that clear whose arm it was, but there was a shooting episode. Huey Newton was wounded, the policeman was wounded, and the policeman died, and Huey Newton didn't, and he got charged with murder. And that was the time I was arriving there, and so I was in the midst of this Free Huey movement, a trial for a Black man. It became a symbol, in a way, a symbol of what was going on in the country. Here's a young man, he's Black, he was attacked, he was in a confrontation with the police, and he ends up dead. I mean, we've heard this over and over and over and over. We'd heard it over and over and over again. But the difference was this particular Black man was in an organization called the Black Panther Party, and this particular organization had an artist named Emory Douglas and had an information minister named Eldridge Cleaver, and a lot of other people who were very talented, very determined, and they wanted to sort of like draw the line. This is it. You know, we're just not going to have this gas chamber. This man is not. We organized Free Huey. Free Huey. That we get him out of the trial, get him out of the gas chamber, and that was our slogan. And the police had a slogan: "Hang Huey" or "Gas Huey." You know, "Gas Huey" and "Hang Gary." That was his lawyer. Well, they didn't like him either. Well, that particular time, that was 69. I mean, not 69. It was 68. It was a ferment around the world, liberation movements, Africa, Vietnam War, women's movement. That was, I think, right around, a little bit after that is when LBJ said he wasn't going to run for re-election, which was quite a shock to most people. In the era of the movement, there was a moment in which Huey Newton was wounded in a confrontation with Oakland police. Now, a lot of people get wounded in confrontations with the police, a lot of Black young men. Huey Newton just so happened to be the leader of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. He also happened to, both of them, the policeman and Huey, were wounded. Huey survived, the policeman didn't. And so here we have a murder case, and Eldridge Cleaver was a member of the organization. He wasn't supposed to be. He was an ex-convict on parole, and he was not supposed to associate with people who carried weapons. So he was an underground secret member. But what he said after Huey's arrest was, it's more important for Huey not to go to the gas chamber than for me to stay off parole. So he just became public, went out, made speeches. I helped him, I'd write them, I'd organize demonstrations. We became mobilizers in Oakland, and along with a lot of members of the party who were students of Black Student Union in San Francisco State. Mm-hmm. I'd say the majority that year of 67, 68 of the Black students were Black Panthers. And San Francisco State had I think it had the most radical movement on the campus. And some of the faculty helped, but not higher power, not him. Wasn't he the principal? I mean, he became a joke of San Francisco. Anyway, he was a professor of linguistics, and he had written Sense and Sensibility, and he was quite articulate. But he had no clue of what to do with the Black Panthers on his campus, or anything else in front of him. And so the uprising in '68 was ebullient, it was terrifying because of the war, and this era of, because of California. Now, I lived in Georgia, I lived in Alabama, I lived in New York, but California is very, very different. And when I got out there, I had a big afro, and so people would say, oh, that's a white girl with an afro. You know, like, in Georgia, you can't be a white girl with an afro. And then Eldridge Cleaver was a writer who was hired by a magazine called Ramparts, and Ramparts was a radical, slick monthly. Monthly, yes, but it was no slick magazine that had that kind of coverage, and he was a writer for that, so he was getting publicity. I'll never forget the cover they had with a woman who was Madame Bin, not Madame Bin, Madame the one who was the one who was the wife of the premier of Vietnam. Yeah, she was on the cover dressed as a Michigan State cheerleader, because Michigan State was putting so much money into the kind of weapons and training that they were using in Vietnam. And so Eldridge was a writer at Ramparts magazine, which is on the left and very critical and very explosive, not explosive, very slick. It was the first time you see a slick, smooth, high design, radical magazine. It's probably the last time too, right? And so here I am in California. The Black Power era, the Black Power movement, Eldridge Cleaver proposed to me as soon as I got out there. He said, let's get engaged. And I said, okay. He said, we get engaged to do something. Well, what's that? Get married. Let's get married. I said, okay. We have 2 children. And about 16 grandchildren, all of which are the children of my son, except for one. Anyway, that's what do you call it, digression. But the era of the Black Panther Party was the era of Vietnam and the era of Black consciousness and the era of women's activism. It was very, very, what you call it, vibrant. It was dangerous, and it's left a mark. It's left a mark that's so vivid. Mm-hmm. It's hard for me to realize how vivid it is. I happen to be in this film, a real film, not a pretend documentary type film, a real film called Subversive Point. Now, why was I in it? Because Antonio, what's his last name? Antonioni. Did not speak English, but he was making a film, a scripted film in California, and he needed a group of people to do a scene that was a Black student movement. And just so happened that the American director that he was working with didn't speak a word of English, happened to know Black Panthers, and so all the Black Student Union people in this film were all Black Panthers. And I was in it, and the issue of power, the issue of students, this was becoming very, very mainstream. I mean, the people who were in the Black student movement in California or in other places, I know more about California, are now, well, they're senior citizens. If I can say Danny Glover's a senior citizen, I'm not sure. Yeah. He was in the Black Student Union and was supported by the Black Panther Party. So what I'm trying to get at is that movement has, what do you call it? It's the adults and the senior citizens now who were of that time. It's not clear to me that the opportunity, because of the dislocation of the era of Vietnam and also the newness of women's liberation and the shock of black people going out and just say, no, we're not taking that,
Yeah.
off the pig, free the land, or, let your hair grow natural. It was an exuberant time of liberation, and it was very, what I learned later, very distressing to the government of the United States. Because I got to read some of their memos and things that they wrote and things that they said. And so I was married to the information minister, who was a member of who had been a black Muslim before, but now he got away from Islam, got into the Black Panther Party. But he was a writer for Ramparts, but he was an ex-convict. He ended up being arrested in a shootout in Oakland with a bunch of other Panthers. There were 8 all told, in which one person was killed. That was a young man named Bobby Hutton, who was 17 years old. And he was wounded, and a whole group of them were arrested. The only difference is that Eldridge was arrested as a person out on parole. So that was it. You going back to prison. It was quite stunning that when he actually went to the court in Solano County to be arraigned and then had a hearing, the judge actually allowed him to get out on bail. And his reasoning was the reason that Eldridge Cleaver was arrested and put behind bars was because he was too eloquent in pursuing the goals of his liberation. So that's a good one. Well, he was eloquent, but he was also arrested in a battle with the Oakland police. But this judge was willing to allow him out on bail, and he did, and he happened to be a candidate for the Peace and Freedom Party ticket for president. Even though he was too young to be president, he was still a candidate, and he got to travel around the country running for president. And at one point he traveled to airport, disguised as an old man, being carried onto the plane by a young lady who was white, who was a nurse, and disappeared. He disappeared because he went to Montreal, and from Montreal he got on a boat that was a freighter from Cuba and ended up in Havana when he was supposed to go back to prison for a shootout. And so when I was in the United States, I was trying to get to Havana to join my husband. It wasn't easy. It was illegal. And there was a blockade. So how do I get to Havana? Well, first I have to go to France and meet a lady named Ellen Wright, who's the wife of Richard Wright, who was going to help me. And I meet her, and she tells me, oh, Julia will help you. And so then we have to get in touch with the Cuban embassy, which we never managed to do. So I ended up, what we'll do is you go to Algeria, and there you can get a plane, it's called Aeroflot, a flight on Aeroflot will take you all the way to Havana. So I said, oh, I'm on my way. And I get to Algiers. Right before I get there, I get a telegram, when you get to Algiers, stay there. Eldridge is coming to meet you. Why would I, it's like, the night I'm getting on the plane to go catch another plane to go to Havana, I get the message to stay in Algiers, which is what I ended up doing. Eldridge did end up coming, we ended up having 2 children. One of them was born in Algiers. We ended up having an international section of the Black Panther Party. But what I'm getting at is the dynamics that we were in that radical time of liberation, challenging women's rights, challenging black oppression. We got to engage with African liberation movements that were many headquartered in Algeria. Why? Because Algeria had been a French colony, and as a French colony, it had a lot of the technology and resources that you need to put on a big festival like the Pan-African, and also they had representatives of liberation movements everywhere. I'm sorry, that's not for you. I just wanted to know the time. And so we were able, by being in Algeria at the time of the Pan-African Cultural Festival, to make contacts with Palestinians, to make contacts with Eritreans, to make contacts with any liberation movement that was based in Algiers, including Palestinians, who not necessarily the liberation movement, but they were actually the people who helped us the most. Why? They spoke English. So they could explain how we could rent a space, how we could do this. And well, there was a consensus of ideas of what the world was about and who was on the side with us and who wasn't. So we kind of had this in common. And it was a moment. I mean, this was a moment that the Pan-African in 68, I think, 68, 69, Pan-African, 69. First Pan-African Cultural Festival, jazz musicians from America, African musicians from everywhere, dancers. Miriam Makeba was the star of the show. Stokely Carmichael at that time was married to Miriam Makeba. He wasn't the star, but he was there. So it was an exuberant moment that people felt liberation was going to happen, liberation was possible. What I'm discovering now is that those ideas are still here.
Yes.
The results were atrociously repressed. That doesn't mean we won't rise again, but I'll tell you, it's another generation. The ideas, the goals, the concept of liberation, the belief in it, and I think we just may even have a broader, it was, the liberation struggle of that time was at the tail end of a massive waves of independence, and in countries becoming independent from colonialism in Asia and Africa, and it was tremendously exciting, but that moment was sabotaged, those leaders were killed, those movements were challenged, and it took a long time, but basically it's gone. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It's gone, but it has to come back, and we have to come back, and the Black Panther slogan was power to the people. I think that's universal.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Time for about 15 minutes of questions from the audience.
Questions for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that incredible panel. You gave us so many provocative ideas to think through. I wanted to respond to, I posed a question to Rabab in particular and then make another comment. So Rabab, I wanted to say that, well, first of all, thank you for your activism and raising your voice around Palestine. It's incredibly inspiring. I wanted to say that I find in my work as someone who works on Black Power, and especially looking at people who identify themselves as being on the left, I have come across pamphlets from the Democratic Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in many people's personal papers. I always take pictures of it. I've investigated the group myself. I found work on September counter-revolution in Jordan, on terrorism, the role of the party, Leninism versus Zionism. Those are just some examples.
Right.
So I just wanted to say that maybe they were better at getting their ideals out than had been previously understood or thought. That they did actually participate in circuits of knowledge and exchange in Black bookstores and the pamphlets being read and circulated within the radical Black community in the U.S. So I wanted to offer that. And then Kathleen, thank you so much for being here. I think you're giving us the strength and the humor and the joys of those times and the challenges in the midst of your own personal crisis of unimaginable depth. So we really appreciate you being here and modeling, what it meant to be a strong Black Panther woman.
Thank you. All right, so I think this is very interesting because I also found a lot of the stuff of Fatah everywhere around, like in Algeria, in South Africa. I was talking to Rosemary Mealy and Sam Anderson. They were saying, how come we only met with Fatah? How come we, and so everywhere. And I think with Fatah, I think it has to do with the fact that they were actually talking about the PLO, representing the PLO and so on. And also the relationship with the US was only with people who were exiled from the US, for the PFLP, for example. It was US imperialism, no way, there was complete break. Now, I think with the DFLP, it came out later. I'm not sure if it's that period, and I'm not sure if that does not have a relationship with the CPUSA, the Communist Party USA, because the DFLP actually had a much better relationship with the Communist Party of the United States. Yes, because the Israeli Communist Party was not present, did not have relations. They did come. CPUSA toured Felicia Langer and Tawfiq Zayyad in 1987. They were here and there, but it wasn't, the Israeli Communist Party was not actually trying to kind of like gain relations with other people and so on. They met everybody else at the Comintern. So really they did not, in Moscow and no, it's true. I mean, this is where they will meet people in the Moscow and at Patrice Lumumba University or in Havana International Youth Festival and places like this. So they did not really need to do the kind of outreach that these Palestinian groups, who actually were completely like really non-governmental with a small n and small g, not the NGOs, and so they really wanted to reach out to a lot of people and advocate for Palestine. But the CPUSA actually adopted the DFLP. I mean, I do know because I was in New York all throughout the 80s, and I was actually trying to kind of like talk to all left, all peace movement, all justice movement, and so on. And this was actually very prominent. So it's very interesting because then later on, you start seeing with radical organizations. Okay, so I was talking to Terry Collins from the Black Student Union, Black Panther Party, and he's always saying, we knew Habash, and I met him at the demonstration, talked to him at the demonstration, and also the 2008 anniversary of the strike, and he would say, George Habash, we knew George Habash, but how did you know George Habash? There were some ideas that were circulating at the time that they were reading things about a particular thing, and I think it came maybe through the Organization of Arab Students that was very much anti-colonial and that supported Arab nationalism, in general, anti-colonial nationalism. This was another strand. So I think this is a very long discussion, so you and I can have, and many people, that actually talks about the circulation of what happens with Palestinian left and Palestinian in general stuff. Where is it going? How is it that it stops SNCC funding? SNCC issued a publication supporting Palestine, all of a sudden all the funding
because
dries out.
most of them came from Jewish people. Case closed.
I would say Jewish Zionist people because they were
Well, people who had money,
Yeah.
big money to give to SNCC didn't want to do it after that.
But anyway, I'm not going to take more time, but this is a topic I would love to continue talking about.
This is a very small point, but you mentioned the '68 Olympics, and I think it's important to note that Tommy Smith and John Carlos, when they were writing their original statement, there was a whole paragraph in solidarity with the Mexican students who were being massacred in the square. And they were being massacred not only because of educational issues, but the IOC and the Mexican government did the security sweeps because they wanted this to be a glowing global capitalist city. And so I think that's a very important connection for us to remember.
Yes, this is a wonderful panel, and most people here don't remember 68. But those of us who do remember there was one crystallizing event. That was in January of 68, the Tet Offensive. Because the Tet Offensive taught us that the empire would be defeated. And many of us have not forgotten that. And Kathleen is right, it never went away. The Iraq War came, the demonstrations actually against the Iraq War were bigger than any demonstrations we had against the Vietnam War. It's still there today. My name is Bruce Franklin, by the way.
This is to Diana. Diana, I know you focus on the development of the Asian left in the 60s, but there is the legacy of the Japanese and Chinese activism during the period of the height of the Communist Party, and then the subsequent expulsion of those members as a result, excuse me, as a result of the CP's position on the post Pearl Harbor. So
Right.
maybe, I don't know. So the question I have is, I was trying to formulate is, how did that impact? Like Rabab said, in the Arab world, the negative political perspective of the Soviet Union impacted the development of communist revolutionary movements because it was, it would be an argument against.
Yeah.
So how did that impact the development or the possibility of developing, or did not help the development of the left in the 60s, given the reactionary legacy of the Communist Party in the 50s?
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
So there was a Japanese American left, right, that was active. It was the immigrant communities. It was the second generation. Josephine Fowler writes about it. Yuji Ichioka writes about them. And then, right, you're right, with the CPUSA had these, right, horrible policies as soon as they flipped when, you know, Nazis invade Poland and they flipped their position from it being against the Nazis to, you know, being in alignment, and they kicked the Japanese out of the CPUSA for the duration of the war, right? And from what I can see, right, in the concentration camps, there's actually a lot of protest from people who were never before active, like the draft resistors. But this was not radical politics. I mean, there were some elements of people who had, like Kazuijima, who had been in the Young Communist League, but it really seems from everything that I've seen, and there needs to be more research, that it wasn't this sort of really radical politics. And it seems like so much of what comes out of Japanese American radicalism in the 60s is kind of a break from the earlier groups, and many of them are not allied at all with the CPUSA by that time, right? They see them as fairly regressive. And so they're aligning with other kinds of movements, the Third World decolonization, Black Power, and things like this. And but through the movement, through organizing in the 60s, they come to learn that there still are these Japanese American radicals. So one is Paul Kochi, who was with the CPUSA and was actually up for deportation as a result of the McCarran and the McCarran-Walter Acts. And he starts hanging around in Little Tokyo, and Mo Nishida talks about it, saying, you know, who are these people who are hanging out with us? The Chinese in the Bay Area talk about the same thing, and so the Chinese American, the Marxist left reemerges, right? And then they learn about this radical past. So I think that, I used to think it was all rupture, but there is still more continuity, even though I think that, at least within Japanese America, like I'm studying a group called Nisei Progressives, and they were not Marxist. You know, they had some anti-imperialist politics, but that really wasn't very alive unless people can see it. I would love to talk to you, but I'm not seeing it at all. But what gets revitalized in the 60s inspires the older left as well.
Hello everyone, thank you all for the wonderful talk, for sharing your wisdom, sharing the space with us. My name is Yahya, I'm at the University of Michigan. So I had a couple questions. My first one is particularly to Dr. Burden-Stelly, is that right? And also maybe to Rabab, not necessarily the content of your talk, but just being in San Francisco State. I'm wondering, so you mentioned so you mentioned sort of the Black Studies movement's demands for autonomy, self-determination, and sort of having third world people in the upper echelon of the university and like representing, you know, throughout the decision-making spaces of the university. I guess so. My question is, given sort of this neoliberal moment with like diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, we're starting to see sort of more and more representation in these positions, but I'm also still seeing that as having like one, a PR role, and two, like a pacification role, at least in my experiences. So I'm guessing, like, so I'm feeling like that representation isn't necessarily translating to, I guess, as liberatory, you know, of a result as you know, these students maybe were intending when they were first fighting. So I guess my question is, given sort of the lessons of this moment, and based off of sort of those demands, what lessons can we sort of take from that fight, and sort of what are your thoughts about DEI initiatives in this moment? My second question is to Dr. Fujino and also to Dr. Cleaver. So I'm kind of wondering, so I don't know much about IWK, and the other group you mentioned was Wayman-Safe. But so I'm wondering, so particularly, you know, there's a lot of attention that's been given to COINTELPRO's role in sort of destabilizing and decimating like a lot of these movements in the 60s. Even then, I still think it's not enough attention. You know, these weren't just like a few operations here and there, but thousands of concentrated operations. I'm wondering what role did COINTELPRO have, if any, in those movements that you mentioned, as well as where are sort of the organizers and those involved in those movements now? And this sort of extends to Dr. Cleaver's conversation about Rab Brown and you know, of course, you yourself are here, so.
I'll start. So I think that these are, I mean, well, I call this having a couple chips in the cookie, right? When you have like some colors in the upper echelons, that is not the same project, right? So I think that what the Black Studies students were demanding was a redistribution of power. That is not about representation and recognition by the state as such. And so the incorporation of racialized persons in this particular moment, in a post-racial, multicultural moment, is about maintaining the system and having some persons of color to legitimate the power structure, which is it was not what the students in 1968 were demanding. So they did not only want random Black folk, right? They, first of all, they wanted the people that they chose. So they wanted people that had politics. They also wanted to be involved in the selection process, not only in terms of choosing who would be in like the board of directors, but also tenure. And that was the number one thing that the administration pushed back on. They're like, we'll give some money for financial aid. You know, we'll bring a few more on campus. But they would, when it came to tenure, like students having a say with respect to tenure and choosing personnel, there was almost a unanimous pushback against that by faculty and by administration. And so I would not say that these are similar projects. And we see this happen a lot, whereby the right or the liberals will take radical policies and de-radicalize them. Everything that we have that's progressive, we owe to the left. Social Security, minimum wage, the end of child labor, right? All of these things are left initiatives that become neutralized once they become incorporated to reinscribe the capitalist system.
Very quickly. Very quickly. We've been actually talking and interviewing the strikers from '68, and they're not uniformed. So there are even people in BSU, some people have passed, they're no longer alive, but some people have fought, and some people who are actually like carrying the struggle now for the Arab and Muslim ethnicity and diaspora studies. They're going to the meetings now at the university. They're celebrating, the university is celebrating, and they're going every single day saying we want an Ahmed Studies program because we believe this is what we fought for then. This is what we need to fight for now. Nathan Hare was fired. Okay, he was the professor, one of the professor advisors. They got rid of a lot of, and the students actually wanted a college of third world studies. The university came and gave them ethnic studies to make it ethnic and to make it like identity politics, so we can have one of each, and then it becomes representational, and then we say, oh, we're really great because we have the Black and the brown, we have everybody sitting at the table, and actually the politics is institutionalized. I mean, this is the problem, is that institutionalizing neoliberalism. So what is going on, and this is really the problem, and this is the challenges that many of us, and I'm very happy to say that very publicly because everybody knows what my position is that this is what we really need to do. The College of Ethnic Studies needs to be at the helm of anti-Zionism, anti-racism, against white supremacy, against Nazis on campus, against tuition hikes, against everything. They cannot be just like every single day dining and whining and doing photo ops. You know, people died for this. People died for this 50 years ago, struggled for this, and we really need to hold them accountable. I'm going to continue doing it, and I hope everybody else will join us to hold them accountable, because it doesn't belong. There is no ownership of the question of producing knowledge for justice. They do not own it, and we need to hold them accountable. They can want to keep the seats, that's fine. I don't really have a problem with it. Everybody can become dean and administrator, but we really need to hold them accountable. It's really, really important to do that.
All right, well, with that, we're at time. Thank you.